No other battlefield in France is so sacred to the memory of the Canadian Corps as the shell-scarred slopes of Vimy Ridge.
April 9th to April 12th, 1917. 100,000 Canadians fought at Vimy Ridge. Over 10,000 were wounded and nearly 3,600 were killed. But it would be the biggest single Allied advance so far on the Western Front.
Vimy was the Canadian sector of the front in France. Time and again, and for months on end, Canadians had fought around Vimy. Wherever they were sent, from Passchendaele to Amiens, they always came back to the shadow of the ridge.
Translation of captured German secret document.
The Canadians are known to be good troops and are therefore well suited for assaulting. There are no deserters to be found amongst the Canadians. It is certain that the Canadian attack will be on a large scale and will happen, we believe, sometime between the 20th of March and the 6th of April.
Vimy Ridge itself is about 475 feet above sea level. The Germans occupied the heights. They had a perfect view of our trenches.
And the trenches were full of water.
The communication trench was above your knees in mud.
I tried for 6 hours with 8 heavy draft horses and 100 men, and I got one gun moved about a quarter of a mile.
Greatcoats coming down halfway between your knees and your ankle gathered up mud, and it would get on there 2 and 3 inches thick, and it would be awful heavy. We just took our jackknives and hacked them off into shorter coats to keep them out of the mud.
There was a great deal of tunneling going on and a great deal of blasting. This meant that the man out on sentry go didn't know whether the enemy were right under his feet blasting or whether it was our own blasting. It was a very, very trying time for the men on sentry go.
You'd be sitting there, innocent as anything, in the trench, and all of a sudden, that was it. The whole front, maybe 1,000 yards of trench would go up, just blown sky high.
You could hear the shrieks when the thing blew up and they were just buried in it.
They had tunneled Vimy Ridge from one end to the other. And in these tunnels, it was just like an underground city. Dugout, medical rooms, orderly rooms, sleeping quarters. There's a little miniature railroad down there, a narrow gauge railroad, from one end to the other, and carry supplies on, and every 50 to 100 yards there'd be a stairway up to the trench above.
The only thing wrong with the Vimy attack was that we had to cut the wire. It was quite impossible to attack without getting rid of that wire. Therefore, there was no surprise. You couldn't cut the wire without using artillery.
On Easter Sunday, the 8th of April, 1917, the troops behind the front lines moved up to their assembly areas. For the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions were about to move together in one massive joint attack.
Everything was quiet. There wasn't a sound, We all had our watches and we knew what time the bombardment was supposed to start, but when it was 2 or 3 minutes from the time, it seemed a long time before it did happen then even,
It was just like a continuous sheet of lightning, like a prairie fire behind us. You could hear this tremendous swish of the shells overhead, and then just a continuous crash along the line.
From precisely 5:30 to 5:33 on Easter Monday morning, the guns roared. 983 of them, firing 3 rounds per minute into the enemy's foremost trenches. Then the barrage lifted and moved on to pound the second line, and the infantry were away.
When you're away, they were piling the gunfire ahead of us, plowing up everything ahead of you. A rat couldn't live on that ridge. The Germans were down in their dugouts. Of course, they weren't expecting the assaulting troops for 2 or 3 hours yet. Well, the troops were right on top of them.
We lost about 50% of our men on Vimy Ridge, but we lost the most of them in the first half mile.
We lost over 100 killed going from our trench to the first line of the German trench. Machine guns.
My brother, whom I lost at Vimy, was just a very few feet from me when I lost him, actually. He was wounded first, and I dropped into the shell hole to give him first aid. And after giving him first aid, I left him. Of course, I couldn't stay, and apparently he raised up in the shell hole to watch me, see where I went. And I heard the shot fired, and heard it land and turned around to see him fall.
I got my men out in a big shell hole out in no man's land, and there were 3 or 4 shells dropped behind me, and the boys thought I was smashed to pieces. And I could hear the boys talking. Poor old Secord, he got it. Yes, and the son of a gun had the rum ration with him. So just then I appeared and said, "All right, boys, I'm here with your rum ration. 3 cheers."
As wave after wave swept cheering up the ridge in an overwhelming flow of battle, other slower waves were ebbing down. Thousands of German prisoners of war and the Canadian wounded coming back. Now Canadians stood upon the whole southern end of the ridge.
It was hard to realize that Vimy Ridge had been captured and on schedule. There were no cheers and no gleeful shouts.
Here was this beaten German army. For people like myself who had been fighting this enemy for so long and hardly ever seen them, to see all of these thousands of people in confusion coming and going, that was one of the real thrills I got out of the war. That sight, I'd never forget it.
The Canadians had advanced some 4,500 yards, had seized 54 guns, 104 trench mortars, and 124 machine guns, had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, and captured more than 4,000 prisoners.
I happened to be there the day the Germans pulled back, and I was trying to convince my own colonel that the Germans had pulled back, and he wouldn't believe me. So I went down into the village of Vimy and come back and told them I'd been down myself, so I know they've gone. Then they did believe it. I saw the Canadians and myself being tempered into a great nation. The Canadians started out at the first of the war by no means confident of themselves. In fact, they used to poke fun of themselves. We are Sam Hughes's army, with 20,000 men. We cannot fight, we cannot march. What bloody use are we? But when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser, he will say, "Hock, hock, mein Gott, what a blinking fine lot, the Canadian infantry." We had convinced ourselves that we were the finest troops on the Western Front.
There was a feeling that we had mastered this job, and we were proud of the fact.
From Vimy on, we were invincible. Nothing could stop us.
I think myself that was where Canada was born.
Now, thanks. The war wasn't pleasant, but we kept ourselves going by jibing at everything, finding our fun where we could, and we found lots of it. Bruce Bain's father hit off beautifully for all of us, and many of his taglines have lasted to this day. If you knows of a better road, go to it. Good old Alf and poor old Herbert somewhere on the Somme had their cushy dugout made a mess of by a bomb. So they found another hole, and when they crawled inside, a shell came over from the Boche, tumbled with a mighty splosh. Somewhere in a heap of slush, Alf looked up and said, "My gosh, where did that one go to, Albert? Where did that one go?" So, say, "Oh, chummy, that one rummy, bird, tell me if you know what the, why the, how the, why the, where did that one go? Oh, the